This program is a production of SECA. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Bob Shrum, a Democratic media consultant who has written speeches and produced commercials for some of Mr. Buckley's least favorite public officials, Howard Metzenbaum, Paul Simon, Edward Kennedy, Richard Gephardt. In introducing our guests, I have to confess a possible conflict. I worked with Linda Chavez in the presidential campaign of Senator Kennedy and against her when she ran for the U.S. Senate against Barbara Mikulski. I'm glad my side won, but I have known and respected Linda Chavez for years. She has been an assistant to President Reagan, an official of the American Federation of Teachers, and an articulate voice of the new ethnic politics in America. Our second guest is National Review senior editor Richard Brookhiser, author of a new book, The Way of the WASP, which is not a reference to Bill Buckley's debating style, but to Mr. Brookhiser's thesis that the received values of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture are the best guides to national policy and perhaps the best preparation for national leadership. Mr. Brookhiser, who also contributes to The New Yorker, allows that WASPs are bad dancers and lousy lovers, but profoundly adept at writing constitutions and running countries. The Way of the WASP is a manifesto calling for a revival of the place and power of the original American immigrants, who Mr. Brookhiser carefully points out are not merely Anglo-Saxon, but specifically English. All this presents a problem, particularly in the context of this program. How can we possibly imagine a ruling elite in which William F. Buckley, Jr. does not qualify to be a member? Is Bill entirely Irish, or is there perhaps a saving drop of English blood? We know Mr. Buckley is Catholic, too, and more Catholic than at least some popes. But here Mr. Brookhiser saves him by writing that the Catholic Church has been, and I quote, WASPized, domesticated, and that good Catholics have become good WASPs. So let me start the discussion with a question for Mr. Buckley. Bill is perhaps the ultimate alumnus of Yale, the heir of a distinguished family, and for many years one of the nation's foremost Tories. Do you qualify as a WASP?
Well, I think that depends on the extent to which there's taxonomic rigidity in interpreting the word WASP. The word WASP has the word Protestant in it, and I'm not a Protestant. To the extent that the two merge, you're either saying that Protestantism has become so etiolated as to mean not very much, or else the Catholics are becoming rather indistinct as a class of their own. But what do you say about that point, Rick?
Well, literally speaking, none of us here is. But the most important thing I think about is WASP. I mean, I'm not. Brookhiser doesn't make the cut. It's a German last name. But the most important thing about these people was not that they were once a majority in America, but it was a character type and a national character type they put in place to which non-WASP Americans have been assimilating for the last 150, 200 years.
So to what extent is it therefore extra ethnic, if you like? That is to say, if we really use the word WASP simply because we once designated white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but now simply vaguely means what?
Well, it doesn't vaguely mean anything. There was a certain style, if you will, of living, of running societies that these people put in place.
You're industrious?
A work ethic.
Anti-centralist?
Right, leery.
Success-minded?
Civic-minded, and driven...
That leaves him out, doesn't it?
Well, you know, unlike all what civic-minded means is that when you look at a group of more than one, when you're looking at groups of people, the group you consider most important is not the family, it's not the clan, it's not the tribe, it's the polis as a whole, is what the WASP traditionally put their influence on, and that's why you have not had in this country mafias, feuds, kind of ethnic uproar that you regularly have in places like Lebanon or India. It's just historically been at a lower level here.
What about WASP slave masters? Would that be ethnic oriented?
Well, it was originally economic. I mean, it was a need to have plantations run cheaply, to have an agricultural economy run cheaply. And of course, that was the great sin that the WASPs committed, and we're still all paying for that in a lot of ways. Although, in their favor, it can be said that there were always WASPs who recognized that this was a violation of whatever principles they had. And
like Bishop Wilberforce.
Well, Bishop Wilberforce, Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a slave owner, he also wrote "All men are created equal." So, all right, his life was divided, but he recognized the wrong of what it was he was profiting from.
Well, let me ask this, Chavez. In your judgment, does the vision, or if you prefer the fantasy of the WASP, still affect ethnic thought in America in the sense of its being an archetype?
I think what troubles me about Mr. Brookhiser's book and also the discussion about WASP is that somehow we seem to be talking about bloodlines here. And I'm amused as we sit here talking about which of us is WASP. I think I'm probably the most WASP person on this panel on my grandmother's side. In fact, her great-great-great-grandmother was English, Eliza Watt, and so in that sense, I've probably got more of a WASP bloodline than any of you, but obviously that is not what is most striking. In fact, in the United States, what is most remarkable is that these ethnic divisions disappear over time, and in fact, it is now more common for Eastern and Southern Europeans to marry outside of their group than it is to marry within it, and I think that is increasingly becoming true of Hispanics. And we even see some increase in intermarriage rates between blacks and whites. So I think this notion that ethnicity is somehow carried in the blood and that America is an ethnic nation or as an ethnic identity has something to do with bloodlines is to me offensive.
Well, and of course I don't believe that. What I'm saying in the way of the WASP is that these people, because they happen to get here first, put a character type in place, and then what happens after that is assimilation, which happens in any country which gets immigrants. I mean, people who immigrated to Latin America assimilated to Latin American models of behavior. People who went to South Africa assimilated to South African ones. But the people who immigrated to this country, by and large, over the years, have tried to assimilate to the American character type, which I think is what it is, because the country was started up by Protestants of a certain kind who believed in a politics of a certain kind, which was certain sort of English politics.
But more than that, I think they put in place certain institutions which have taken hold, and it is those institutions in some ways that we all assimilate to. The institution of democracy, representative government. These are the things that I think attract people here, along with an economic system that provides them more opportunity than other systems. And it is to that people aspire, and I think that when we become American, it is becoming American in the sense of believing in certain ideals and accepting a culture, which I grant you has more to do with the culture of England than probably any other place.
Well, and it's also true that people who may literally be white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant can also let down the side. They can abandon these ideals. One of the arguments I make is that a lot of the trouble I think the country has, a lot of the problems we have come from an abandonment of these WASP principles of living, and that the main villains in that were WASPs themselves.
Like the Cheever books.
Well, they're a symptom of it. They're
Yeah.
a symptom of it. But you'd have to go back, you know, before John Cheever was born, and I think the rot begins to set in places like liberal Protestant clergymen, certain notions of progressive politics that Woodrow Wilson was instrumental in getting going. And all the people who did this were literal white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but they weren't behaving according to this character type.
They weren't carrying forward the genus that you are, in parts of your book at least, attempting to resurrect. Well, in other parts of the book, but in others to portray. I think it's rather interesting that you remark that Henry James, in order to write comfortably about the WASP, had to live in England, even though he oriented his. Now, where would you put Louis Auchincloss, for instance, in this? As a sort of a nostalgic WASP?
Well, right. He obviously didn't have to move to England, but the fact that there are so few of him, meaning so few WASP writers writing about their milieu, is a symptom of one problem WASPs have with certain types of creativity. I think the way of the WASP is good. I think it has a lot of good effects, but to be honest, they're not very strong in the arts. Never have been. They consume it, they patronize it, they're very good audiences, but WASP creators traditionally have a rough time.
Was Mapplethorpe a WASP?
No, he was Catholic, actually.
Oh, was he?
Well, literally speaking, again. But
I wish I hadn't said that. But what about that anti-centralist John Updike?
Well, you know, again, he's an exception. There are just not a heck of a lot of American, you know, WASP writers. We've exhausted the two. You know, if Updike and Auchincloss were on the same plane and it crashed,
Cousins?
there we'd be gone.
What about Cousins?
Well, living WASP writers.
Yeah.
You know, you can go back and find them, but you know, even ones who were great often led very conflicted lives because it was just not the thing to do. James had to get out. Poe was a drunk. I mean, you know, it wasn't like being an English writer or a French writer.
Well, let me ask this Chavez a provocative question, if I may. Ms. Brookhiser says in his book that the WASP really have been pretty good at public policies. They accept pluralism. They accept rule by the majority. By contrast, between yesterday and today, there were 2 coups d'etat in Latin America. And I think somebody somewhere counted that Bolivia, having had its 149th coup, probably ought to celebrate, or make plans for celebrating the 150th, since it will predictably come. Now, is there something about the Hispanic culture which here grates against the WASP culture in its inability historically to handle democracy, perhaps because of the long period during which Latin America was colonized by the Spanish compared to our...
I don't know. I think that clearly until 1990, democracy did not seem to be flowering in all that many parts of the world. And so democracy to me seems the exception. So to point to Latin America and say that there have not been viable, long-standing democracies there, in some ways I think begs the question.
So I'm comparing it to WASP, not to Africa.
I guess the concern, and I think it's a concern that you hear voiced frequently now with so many immigrants coming into the United States, is will the large influx of people into the United States from Latin America in some way change the nature of this society? It's an old refrain. It's the same thing we heard about Southern and Eastern Europeans in the early part of this century. And it assumes that people will not be affected by the society into which they come. And I think that is naive. I think that Latin Americans have no interest in recreating Latin America in Southern California. What they want is the opportunity that this country provides, and they want the political freedom that this country provides. And so I think it's much more likely that we will change, that we will in fact assimilate and absorb and integrate Latin Americans into this culture.
Well, how do you account then for the for the very hearty fight on bilingualism?
Well, I think
is this an indication of a reluctance to assimilate in the conventional way?
I think there's no reluctance among the people to assimilate. I think you have in the bilingual education issue and bilingualism generally a grave difference between the elites of the Hispanic organizations and the people. People from Mexico know that when they come to the United States, if they want to get decent jobs, that they have to learn English. The leadership in the Hispanic community has been pushing bilingualism as a way, I think, to maintain control over that community. It is a way to become a power broker if you are the intermediary between the people and the rest of the society. That is a way to maintain power, and I think that that, plus preserving ethnic identity, has been the basis of the move towards bilingualism. But there, frankly, is no evidence that Hispanic immigrants are not learning English with the same rapidity as previous
Don't polls show that Hispanic people want their kids to learn English?
No, as a matter of fact, the most substantial poll that was done by the Educational Testing Service a couple of years ago of parents of children actually in bilingual classes seemed to be quite confused about what bilingual education was. They have been told by their leaders that bilingual education is the best way to teach non-English speaking children. And so they want their children to learn English. But when you ask parents, would you prefer to have your child learning Spanish if that's going to take away time from their learning English, they resoundingly say no. In fact, they, like all immigrants, want better lives for their children. And they know that the key to that better life is learning the language of commerce in this country.
But language is a purely utilitarian skill. What Mr. Brookhiser talks about is psychological and character predispositions. To what extent is the WASP culture something that Hispanics think of as paradigmatic?
Well, I think that one of the primary features of WASP culture is a belief in the individual and a reverence for individualism. And I think that this is not something that is common to most Latin cultures, whether you're talking about Mediterranean peoples from Italy or whether you're talking about immigrants from Mexico. There's a much more familism notion within the Latin community than there is within the WASP community, and I think this does come into conflict. I think that's one of the reasons, for example, that you see fewer young people, young Hispanics going on to college. There is a sense when you graduate from high school that you now owe it to your family to go out and contribute to the family's income and welfare. And the idea of going on to college, which might benefit you as an individual, but the family doesn't see it as a benefit to the group, is something that is not encouraged as strongly.
But it's also the case that some of these things do change or moderate over time. In the way of the WASP, I discussed the Catholic Church in the United States, which has been the largest denomination in the United States since 1850. There were millions and millions of Catholics here for more than a century. And when Catholics first started immigrating from Ireland and from Germany, there were lots of WASPs who were very alarmed by this, and they wondered how can they possibly assimilate? Aren't they under the heel of a foreign, a potentate? The Pope will tell them what to do and all this kind of thing. But what you found was that over less than 100 years, really, the Catholic Church in America had accommodated itself quite happily to the pattern of church-state relations in this country, which was unique in terms of the history of Catholicism. There had never, I don't think there had ever been a country with a non-Catholic majority which had religious freedom at the same time. So this was a new situation for the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church in America fit into it quite happily.
Now, is this one of the traditions that you think are completely firm, or is it one that, in your view, is attenuating?
The particular assimilation of the Catholic Church? Well, ironically, what you're seeing is, I think among a lot of Catholics, you're seeing assimilation to liberal Protestant norms. I view liberal Protestants as among the villains recent American history. But what you're seeing among
So is
Catholics...
God.
Well, all right, but so you will agree with me that in being alarmed at seeing Catholics picking up second-hand old clothes from liberal Protestant theologians. You know, here's the death of God. Well, the Protestants were doing that for a while, and now maybe they're tired of it. And so the Catholics come along and think, you know, Father Curran thinks, oh, isn't this exciting? Let's try this on. I mean, maybe not that specifically, but things of this kind. Yeah. And you must see a lot of that. And so there are also perverse forms of assimilation.
I think it's sort of interesting in the United States, you're seeing among Hispanics a move away from Catholicism and towards the more evangelical Christian denominations. And I think in some sense that is a reaction to the Protestant, sort of mainstream Protestant character of the Catholic Church in the United States, which many Latins find foreign. It isn't the kind of personal religion.
Except it's happening within Latin America also.
Yes, it is. I guess that's true. So that maybe our influence, maybe the Catholic Church worldwide, at least in this hemisphere, is moving in that direction.
We're ruining it all over the world.
Well, which attributes that you think of historically as distinctively WASP are the ones that are, at this particular moment, most enfeebled?
Well, I think the work ethic is being threatened from a couple directions. One is that, as I see it under the WASP model, you were supposed to work hard because work was a good thing in itself. Mm-hmm. And you believed that if you worked hard, you would succeed. Success would be your reward. But you didn't want to be ambitious. You know, ambition was a very problematic thing. Perhaps you felt it, but you didn't want to avow it. More recently, I think Americans are much more willing to say, well, yes, I want it all. I want the whole ball of wax. Greed is good, that famous tagline of 80s Wall Street. Also, I think people are much less willing to see work as a good in itself. They're interested in the payoff. They want the gratification. And the notion of spending 10 hours a day in an office laboring away and then deferring your reward maybe for all of your life, maybe only your children will get it, is less attractive than it was 50 years ago.
And is this because of inner dissipation of the integrity of the WASP ideal, or is it because it is being overwhelmed by hedonistic alternatives?
Well, inner dissipation, which then lets the hedonistic alternatives fill the vacuum. And I think the source of a lot of the inner dissipation is religious. A lot of what made WASPs tick and get up in the morning and go out and do WASPy things was because they thought, you know, it was ordained. This was the way you have to live. This divine sanction is placed on this way of life. And then as they stop believing that, the motor runs down.
And there has been a difficulty in replacing the divine sanction with a civic sanction.
Well, or with a sanction from wherever. I mean, it's hard. You know, Samuel Johnson said that the liberal clergyman will say that drink clouds the noble faculty of reason, whereas the Scottish clergyman will say if you drink, you'll die in a ditch and go to hell. Mm-hmm. And he preferred the Scottish clergyman because that's what people sit up and take notice of. And you know, there are fewer people saying that in America over the last 75 years.
Now, in your book that has been finished but doesn't come out yet, do you accost this thesis, Ms. Chavez?
Well, I think that, at least for Hispanics in the United States, that there is tremendous assimilation taking place and integration, and I think that we have a very confused picture of what's happening with Hispanics because it is a new population. 25 or 30 years ago, most persons of Mexican origin were U.S. born. They were people like myself whose families trace their roots back many generations in the United States. Today, 1 out of every 2 adult persons of Mexican origin is a new immigrant. Mm-hmm. And so you have a somewhat confused picture if you look at it as a composite and you try and look and see how they're doing in terms of education, how they're doing in terms of income.
Our time is up. I think there was less conflict here than there usually is, because I suspect that much of Mr. Brookhiser's apologia for WASP values, both here and in the book, sounds more like a gloss or an overlay for a set of conservative ideas that are more political than ethnic. I think that Mr. Buckley, Ms. Chavez, and Mr. Brookhiser would all denounce with equal fervor certain forms of affirmative action or bilingualism. My guess is that the ideas ought to be judged on the merits rather than on their pedigree. So speaking of that and taking up one of the ideas that Mr. Brookhiser does in his book, I would like to ask Mr. Buckley, given the conservative anger about affirmative action, and given that we had minority slavery when WASPs ran this country, what's so wrong with having minority scholarships to go to college today?
Well, what's wrong is the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal treatment under the law. There's no way in which I can discriminate in favor of an Indian without discriminating against a Mexican or a white man or whatever. The whole understanding of the civil rights struggle of the 60s, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a safe challenge, was to cause the evanescence of color. Martin Luther King said, let's dream of a world in which nobody recognizes that his skin is black and his skin is white, his skin is pink or whatever. And I think that is a reiteration of the idea of equality that satisfies conservatives. There were of course quarrels about how to achieve it, and WASPs were themselves divided depending on whether their roots were southern or northern. Any problem with that?
No.
No problem. Well,
you were right. It was hard to challenge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shrum, and thank you, Mr. Richard Brookhiser, the author of The Way of the WASP, which you must all read for your edification. And thank you, Ms. Chavez and gentlemen. Welcome.